The following is a production of Notch 6 Media.
It's the Notch 6 online podcast, episode number 57. In this episode, Joey Ricard from Trackside Scenery joins me to tell you how to take your scenery to the next level. It's all ahead on this episode of Notch 6.
This is the Notch 6 online podcast. Notch 6 is the podcast dedicated to O-gauge trains. Whether you're collecting, operating, or just getting started, Notch 6 is your home for O-gauge news, events, and interviews. Now here is your host, Derek Thomas.
Well, welcome into another episode of Notch 6, brought to you each and every episode by the fine folks at trains.com. That's trains spelled with a Z. You know, we're going to be talking about scenery for your layout today, and at trains.com, they have an entire selection of scenery items, including ground cover, buildings, realistic water, you name it, they have it. Scenery for your layout at trains.com. That's trainz.com. Thanks as always to Scott and Melinda Griggs for sponsoring the program. Well, let's jump right into it. It's June, and it's been an interesting month in the O-gauge world. Of course, the big headline, if you haven't heard yet, is that Weaver Models is going to be closing the doors at the end of June here. And I'm not terribly surprised by the news. Definitely saddened by the news, but not terribly surprised. We've heard the rumor floating around for about a year and a half now, and some things came to light earlier in the spring that kind of signaled that a big change was coming, and that change has come or is coming, depending on when you're listening to the episode. And, you know, it's left a lot of people wondering, you know, what's going to happen to the Weaver tooling? Why won't somebody buy it and keep it open? A lot of questions, and yeah, they're valid questions, but there are a lot of things that a lot of folks don't see that it takes to operate a model railroad company like Weaver on a day-to-day basis, and there's so many things that people don't even consider as part of the cost of being in this business. And I think that, coupled with a very, I don't want to call it uncertain future, but definitely some stiff competition out there in the O-gauge industry, has made some people shy away from stepping up to the plate and jumping into this thing head first and buying Weaver models. And again, terribly sad to see them go. I've got a couple engines and at least a handful of their freight cars on my layout, and I've always enjoyed some of the road names that they produce. Some stuff that is obscure by the hobby standards in terms of they've done some Conrail cars that nobody else would even dare to touch. They've done custom runs for just about every major player in the hobby in terms of, you know, hobby stores. And they've filled a nice niche for quite some time. I would love to think that somebody is going to step up to the plate and pick up some of the stuff in terms of the tooling and the printing, but I don't know at this point if that's really going to be feasible for a lot of folks. And so, you know, again, not terribly surprised by the news, but, you know, it's just part of the process that this hobby is going through right now. And not to be upbeat and positive, you know, they've been spelling the end of this hobby since the 1960s, and slot cars and HO trains were going to be the ruin of us all. Well, not exactly. We're still here, and we're still clicking along. And, you know, if anything, I think we're in a point now where we have more options in O-gauge and in model railroading in general than we've ever had before. And so it's a great time to be in the hobby with all the innovation that's coming along. But again, you know, the marketplace can only handle so much product. And, you know, in Joe's case over at Weaver, who is the owner, it's time to retire and hang it up and move on to other things that he wants to enjoy. You know, when it's a day-to-day business, it consumes your life, especially when the chips and the buck stops with you. You know, it can be pretty overwhelming. And I say that from the standpoint of the Madison Poster Company is a blip on the radar compared to some of the stuff Weaver's done over the years. And there are days where, it's a lot of work just to keep Madison Poster going and keep it fresh and make sure we get all of our advertising materials in and our paperwork filed. And, there are so many things that people don't see that it takes to run the business. But, it just consumes you and you do it because you love it. Anyway, we won't spend too long on this. That's my 2 cents on the Weaver thing. We'll kind of keep watching and see if somebody comes in at the 11th hour to pick up the tooling or some things like that. And I'm sure you guys will know about it pretty quick. And, of course, we'll discuss it here on the program if and when that happens. Our best wishes go out to Joe and the entire Weaver staff as they move on to new adventures. And we wish them nothing but success. And for Joe, we wish you a lot of happy days in your retirement. I hope you're moving on to some stuff that you're really going to enjoy. Okay, the other big news for June is that it is June, and next month means July, which for us means the LCCA National Convention. And I don't want to completely skip over. The TCA National Convention is coming up in New York here, actually, right around the time that this episode comes out. It may be this week when the episode comes out that the TCA National Convention will be going on. And Madison Poster got involved in that. We donated one of our large posters to the live auction at the banquet. And so it'll be fun to see Greg Stout get on the podium and auction off one of our posters. And hopefully somebody gets to take it home that can use it and enjoy it. If you're interested in one of our Lionel dealer posters, check out madisonposter.com. Back to the LCCA. Every year, this will be the 3rd year that we've done this, and this has been around really pretty much since the beginning of this podcast. We have covered the LCCA, Lionel Collectors Club of America National Convention from basically door to door, from Sunday night all the way through Saturday. And we started the tradition, we'll see if it stays a tradition. We started the tradition last year of actually being present at the convention. And it was easy last year because it was Indianapolis, which is right in my backyard. Things change a little bit this year. We're going to Boston, Massachusetts, and not exactly in the backyard of Lafayette, Indiana anymore. So Christy, my wife, Henry, my 14-month-old son, and I will be hopping on a plane to Boston, and we will be throwing ourselves into the middle of the LCCA National Convention. A lot of great things scheduled for that week, and this is going to be, it's the last week of July. We're flying in on Wednesday, even though we'll have some coverage earlier in the week. The exact dates for the convention are July 20th through 25th, and we'll be in Boston live starting on Wednesday. We'll have coverage earlier in the week from Sunday forward. A new episode every evening without fail. We've done it the last 2 years. We're going for the 3rd year. It's going to be a little bit different this year just because we're going to be transitioning between Lafayette and Boston on Wednesday. Hopefully I can pull it all off, and it sounds good while we do it. You'll hear some of our new recording equipment this year. The convention should sound a lot clearer, a lot more polished, and again, that's thanks to our sponsors who make this happen, the LCCA and Trains. That's where the money comes from to buy upgraded equipment so we can go out and make this sound good. We may try a couple of other things while we're out in Boston. I'm not going to speculate too much at this point, just because I'm trying to figure out what we can and can't get away with. But if you are a Twitter user, I would highly, highly, highly recommend that you start following Notch 6 Media, NOTCH, the number 6 Media, MEDIA, all one word. If you use Twitter, I would highly, highly recommend that you start following Notch 6 Media. And hopefully we'll be able to do something with that during the LCCA convention. That would be really, really cool. You do need a Twitter account. I know some of you guys are social media adverse, but we might be able to offer you something that will give you a reason to jump in with both feet. So we're gonna kind of see what happens, and hopefully we'll have some more news for you about that as the convention gets closer. But again, follow us on Twitter at Notch 6 Media. All right, time for the main event today. Joey Ricard, Trackside Scenery, and TracksideScenery.com. Joey has an awesome YouTube channel which has some phenomenal videos on taking your scenery really to the next level. And for myself personally, scenery has been one of the more frustrating items on my layout. Just because I see all these beautiful layouts in magazines, and it's just like, how do I get my scenery that nice? Well, Joey has come up with some really practical ways to take your scenery from something that it looks like, was really cobbled together to something that looks incredibly realistic. And I've tried some of his techniques on my own layouts and on the LCCA modular layout, and this stuff works. And it's really not that hard. So Joey Ricard is here to tell us about what it takes to take your scenery to the next level. We'll be back with Joey Ricard right after this message from the Lionel Collectors Club of America.
The LCCA invites you to attend their 45th annual convention July 20th through the 25th in Danvers, Massachusetts. If you like Lionel Trains, LCCA commemorative products, real trains, and want to tour the Boston area, you won't want to miss this spectacular event. We have great tours scheduled for the whole family to enjoy. Don't delay. Join the club and reserve your spot today.
This is Notch 6, your first source for breaking news and in-depth interviews in the world of O-Gauge.
Well, welcome back to the Notch 6 online podcast. I'm happy to have with me today YouTube star Joey Ricard. You may know him from TracksideScenery.com and his YouTube videos under the name Trackside Scenery. Joey, welcome to the show. So happy to have you here.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
So I'm going to start off with the standard question, and no guest escapes this question. Is the number one question. Tell me about growing up and how you kind of got involved in this world of model railroading.
Well, I won't bore you with the traditional Christmas tree train story because I don't have one. I grew up in a single mother home, I should say single parent home. I had older brothers, but they didn't live at home, so I didn't have that influence. My influences came from basic transportation that caught my eye, whether it was trucks, trains, planes, or construction equipment, that sort of thing.
Okay, so you say basic transportation. Where did you grow up that you had access to that kind of transportation?
I grew up just outside of Washington, D.C. in Rockville, Maryland, and we grew up in an apartment. And just down the road was the B&O Railroad, the main line from Baltimore to Chicago. It was I guess it was called the Metropolitan Way subdivision, the Metropolitan subdivision. And, of course, you could go up there and watch trains all day long and see some interesting stuff walking along the tracks.
I bet. Now, were you born when there was still, really active passenger service, or had passenger service started to kind of go away by that point?
The B&O had given way to the chassis system, and it was primarily a line that hosted, freight trains, coal trains, that sort of thing. But there was the Maryland Department of Transportation that ran commuter service, as well as the Capital Limited, which I guess by then had become Amtrak in the early 70s.
Got it. And so for you, when you started seeing these things, how did that translate into, oh, I like trains? When did model trains come into your life?
At the time, model railroading was a lot less expensive than it is now, and I, at a young age, had the ambition to go out and buy my own, toys, with stuff that you would normally have to wait for Christmas for. I would go out and buy model planes and model cars and things like that. What always interested me was the fact that model railroading gave you something to actually do when the model was complete, as opposed to a static model like an airplane or a car.
Okay, that's very true. I'd never thought about that, but yeah, absolutely. That's a big appeal that the trains have a function after the scenery was built. Now, speaking of, and obviously we're going to spend a lot of time talking about scenery today, at that age, did you have a desire for a realistic setting? Have you always kind of had that mindset of, I want it to look as close to the real thing as possible?
I did. I think it all comes down to I wanted to create something that mimicked a real place that I could go to, whether it was day or night or whether I could get there or not. Of course, we all had bikes when I was young, but there was days that even if it snowed or rained, you couldn't go out, and I wanted to see trains. My goal was to create those trains in my house, create that believable scene that I was actually in the spot that I like to go to.
Love it. And that's I think what a lot of us are always striving for is is getting to that place that we remember in our imagines, no matter what time of day or night it is, and realistic scenery plays a really big part in that. And again, we're going to talk about that a lot today. So tell me about how you went from this is a hobby growing up to suddenly I have a business called Trackside Scenery. How did we get from point A to point B?
Well, it all fit naturally. Now, I did work for the railroad for a lot of years, but I've always been a photographer and graphic artist too. When I worked for Norfolk Southern in the 90s, the late 90s, the guys that I worked with, when we went to the away hotel, they would go up and they'd play cards and they would spend time watching TV, where I had a laptop and I got involved with learning how to do graphic arts and anything that caught my interest that I could take photographs of trains or photographs of transportation items that I liked and be able to put them online. I wanted to know how to do that. So I spent time doing that. Well, I've always been a photographer. I always wanted to couple my love of trains and transportation with that art of photography. So I've been doing backdrops and photographic arts and things like that for myself and friends for years. And I noticed that there was a lack of a commercially available backdrop that suited me. And that suiting me means actually becoming part of the scene, but not only what's directly in front of you with one picture, but something that goes to the left and to the right. So I wanted to create something that worked more like Lego blocks, for lack of a better explanation, something you could have in front of you, but also go to the left and the right, and it be a different scene, but connected to it.
Okay. And so you also mentioned to me a little bit of previous experience with actual railroading, that you had worked for Norfolk Southern for a period of time, and you had also mentioned to me a background in photography. I assume those two things helped make creating those backdrops a much easier process.
It did. It made it easy in the fact that I had been there. I had seen what it looks like on the railroad right away. And, we talked about when I was a kid and I was out watching trains, maybe on a daily basis, that you just get that imprinted in your brain of what it looks like along the tracks. And my backdrops, I wanted to give the feeling that whether you were close up to it or far away, you were at trackside. You were literally trackside. That's where the name came from.
Got it. Now I've got to ask you, talking about going back for just a second to your railroading career, and obviously at this point, you had a passion for transportation, and I've heard it said by a lot of folks that if you work for the railroad and people find out that you're interested in railroading from a model railroading perspective, that it can spell real trouble for you on the job. Was that your experience?
No, and it's probably because I've always been a guy that wasn't afraid of what people thought. I don't mean that in a bad way. Of course, you care what people think of you. But if it was something where they didn't have the interest that I had, of course, sometimes you'd hear it and they'd call you the foamer and some other names we don't want to mention on the podcast. But, for myself, it wasn't a problem. But I do know for other guys, they teased them. I was really surprised to find that there are a lot of people that work for the railroad in this day and age that have that interest in trains. Maybe not beforehand, but after the fact they do.
Interesting to hear that there are more people out there. And I'm just going to tell a personal story for half a second. Out chasing Norfolk and Western 611 about 3 weeks ago, I was amazed how many Norfolk Southern employees you would see out along the way waiting for this steam train to come by. And it's like, wow, this is your job, but yet this is interesting enough that you care enough to come out and see this. And it sounds like, it was your experience as well, that there are definitely a decent amount of railroad enthusiasts, I guess would be the right word, that are involved in the real industry.
Absolutely.
So let's get back to scenery. One of the reasons I wanted to bring you on the show is one of the big challenges a lot of us face is how do we make a scene feel realistic? And you've gotten really, really good at doing scenery, and your videos on YouTube show that. What are some of the items that you found are critical to take that step from basic scenery to something that's going to look realistic?
Well, maybe not an item, but I think the concept itself would be a better word. Most people seem to limit themselves with the misconception that they have to buy something specific to place in the spot you want it. A lot of folks these days are swayed by the idea that everything should be quick, easy, and maybe even right out of the box from, off the shelf. While there's a lot of great products out there, not everything comes in a box. So with that, I encourage folks to think outside the box and just remember that there's no rules in model railroading.
Interesting. So let's expand on that a little bit more. You're right that I think a lot of us and there's great companies out there like Woodland Scenics that are putting out some incredible scratch-built buildings now that come done right out of the box. But you can achieve those kind of results really by scratch building and adding details on your own. What are certain details? Let's take a building, for example. If I'm building a building, what are some details that I can take from just like a regular plastic building kit? What are some details that I can add that kind of would step it up to the next level?
Small stuff. And that could be in the form of using small wires, maybe using anything that you can take. If you go take a photograph of an old building, any old building in any part of town, and just look at the details that are around it, maybe the clutter, maybe the wires, something running up the side of the building that once was, a powered electrical device that isn't used anymore. As far as real products, you can use cardboard. I use a lot of cardboard, a lot of poster board, cardstock, just small plastic pieces around the house. It could be anything out of your junk drawer.
Very interesting. Now, when you say you use a lot of cardstock, are you using cardstock to add walls, or what are you using cardstock for to build, I guess would be the right question.
I've used it to make awnings. I've used it to actually make the windows themselves. Depending on how good you can cut, you can do some clean cuts. You can actually cut windows out of them, and they can mimic what normal kits use a lot of small, basswood, as small as 1/64 of an inch, and a lot of those are laser cut. But you can cut that out of cardstock and paint it and have it look just like a painted window frame.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about the scenery that goes around in the world in terms of grass, rocks, things like that. For a lot of us, especially in the O-gauge world, it's, paint the board green, throw some sawdust on it, and rock and roll. We can take it to the next level. And actually, the first video I watched from you last year was how to do dirt. And you think, oh, dirt on a layout, it shouldn't be that big of a deal. And it's really not. But the way you show people how to lay ground cover, and people at this point, they trust you. They know who you are, and those who don't are going to be pleasantly surprised when they get introduced to you because, like I said, you found a way to do this that it makes sense. Something that you've shown me in the videos and that I think a lot of listeners are going to find interesting is when you do scenery, there's, I guess, what I want to call layering involved in terms of, you're right, it's not just a one-step process. Usually there's a series of steps. And as we're talking about things like ground cover and rocks and things like that, let's specifically talk about ground cover for a second. Kind of walk me through the process in just a few steps of what it takes to do realistic dirt on the layout, because it's not just slap down brown paint and call it done. Yeah.
Well, you know why it looks like dirt? It's dirt.
Why? Really?
Just like in the video. It looks like dirt because it's dirt. My philosophy is that there's not many products out there, even with the good companies like Woodland Scenics, there's not many products that can reproduce the look of dirt. There's a lot of clutter, there's a lot of leafy materials and things like that go on top of the dirt, but I haven't seen anything out there that reproduces the look of dirt like real dirt. And with that, you have a lot of options. You can change your colors, your textures, and things like that to suit the area you're modeling. And if you take your time and experiment with it, you can actually make it believable. Then on top of that, you can add the layer of grass or vines, bushes, weeds, and that sort of thing.
Now let's talk about using real dirt, and let's talk about using just real scenery materials, twigs, things like that. I hear a lot of people talk about, well, am I introducing something into my layout that's going to start growing stuff, et cetera, et cetera. How does this stuff hold up over time on a layout? I mean, is it something people should be concerned about, I'm going to start growing real wildlife on my layout?
That's the question that is most asked when I do a scenery clinic at a train show. Should you bake the dirt? Well, I've never baked dirt, and as in the video, I'd probably get in trouble for sticking dirt in the oven. But I don't know that there's any truth to that. I've never had it happen, and I have dioramas in my house that I've had for over 20 years that have, I wouldn't say it was thick dirt, but enough to hold something in there. I've seen nothing. I don't think it's possible.
Okay.
Now, if you're planting, if it's like a house plant and it's thick like that, sure, you're going to grow something. But a thin layer of, filtered or screened dirt, I don't see how there could be anything growing in it.
Very, very cool. And, you're right that there's no replacement for the real thing. We've gotten really good as a hobby at mimicking real life, but sometimes, it's best just to go out and get the real thing and lay it down.
Absolutely. And I've heard people saying you should run a magnet through it. Another thing, I've never had a case where I've had any problem with it affecting my locomotives or rolling stock or anything like that. And I don't know how there's much, there could be any metal particles in filtered dirt like that. I just don't see it. I've never had it happen. I've run a magnet over it just to see. Let me see if this is true, and I've never had anything come up on the magnet. So.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. I have a feeling that you're not going to find many other people who found anything either. I think it may just be people being I don't want to use the word overcautious, but overcautious about
exactly.
it. And that's the other thing, especially, bringing realistic scenery that is dirt and that is twigs and that is, weeds and things like that. The bottom line is model trains are relatively resilient. And yeah, there's a lot of fragile detail parts and things like that. But when it comes to the mechanicals of these trains, they're going to be able to run over some things and, pass by some things and brush against some things on your layout that you don't have to be super careful with, I guess the scenery, so to speak. I mean, yeah, you want to watch clearances so you're not, hitting your buildings and things like that. But for the most part, getting weeds and stuff alongside the tracks shouldn't be a big issue.
Yeah, I guess it all depends where you get your dirt, because if you're digging up out of a construction site in New York City, maybe the dirt's going to be a little different than it would be here in West Virginia. But if you filter it enough, if you screen it and, make sure you get the larger chunks out, I don't think there's any problem.
Okay. One of the biggest questions I've always had, and I've struggled with this technique for a long time, and I feel like the longer I do it, the better I get at it, is making, rocks and rock faces that look realistic. Kind of walk me through your process of how do you get realistic rocks? Is it one of those things that you've done well with foam carving, or what produces the best results for you?
For me, it's plaster. And I use it because I can stick it in a mold and I can slap it on the layout. I can also put it on there like I'm frosting a cake. And then you can come back and use a knife or screwdriver or something like that to score it and give it some lines. The thing I always tell people is you're not going to get it right the first time, and be prepared to add more or take off. And that's another concept that I have is don't be afraid with this, because you're making it and you can start it from scratch again. And nothing is written in stone, so to speak.
Right, and that's one of the big things that we want to put an emphasis on in this episode is Joey's been doing this for a long time, and you and I were talking a little bit before we went on the air. You didn't get good at this overnight. You didn't end up where you're at in one night. So, I mean, how many projects, I'm sure there have been numerous that you've just had to go back and say, okay, I got to do this again because it's not right.
I start every project with the thought that I'm going to have to start it over. And I'm really not kidding when I say that. I'm my own worst critic. And I don't consider myself better than anybody else at doing anything, but I can absolutely assure you that whatever I do, I'm gonna give it my best, and if that means start over, that's what I'm going to do. I did that on the spruce in a couple of the sections that you see.
Huh. And that's a really, I like the mindset because, from my mind, it's like, okay, I just want to get this done and hopefully get it done right the first time. But, in reality, that doesn't happen for me that often where it gets done, exactly the way I want it the first time. And I guess maybe that's what frustrates some of us, that we expect, we hold ourselves to a standard where we think, oh, I'm going to try something new and I'm going to get it absolutely right the first time. And maybe it's changing that mindset that, no, I'm probably going to have to do this a couple of times to get it right, to make it work, and that seems to have worked for you really well.
Well, that's one of the reasons I have had so many dioramas, that if I have a new technique I want to try, instead of wasting my time putting it on the layout, which obviously you can remove it, I spend time working on a diorama not replicating the same scene I want to do, but just the technique itself. I do it on a diorama. If it comes out nice, I can slap a backdrop on it and use it as a photo diorama. But that's my practice, is making, a technique into a diorama. And if it comes out nice, then I keep it. If not, I start it over.
That seems like a good idea, because you mentioned not putting it directly into the layout, which if you can do it on a diorama and it looks good, then you can move something into the layout and build it into the layout, and then you haven't had to go through the work of building it on the layout, realizing it didn't work, and
Absolutely.
having to go back and tear it back out.
Yeah, you can certainly pull it back off the layout, but it sure is a lot easier to get the scene down, or get your technique down on something smaller, and then use that technique on the layout. And I don't know if you followed enough where, or some of my layouts, I actually have taken those dioramas and implemented them into the layout.
Okay. And when you implement a diorama, is it just one of those deals where you can literally cut space into the layout and drop it into place, or how does that work, that you kind of integrate these things in? How do you physically integrate them into the layout?
That's correct. When I plan ahead, the little bit that I do, I usually make a spot for it. I'll stop the bench work or whatever material I'm using. If it's blue foam, I'll cut, the space just enough for the diorama to fit in there.
Okay, and then it's one of those things where you can kind of go back and hide the seams as you work it in?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. I want to talk to you a little bit about O-gauge scenery for a second. Working in O-gauge, obviously our trains are a little bit larger than HO. What does that kind of allow for O-gauge and O-scale modelers to do scenery-wise that is tougher to do in smaller scales? What about our larger scale makes doing scenery easier?
Well, in my case, I had always wanted to model in O-scale because of the size, of the ability to add more detail to it. And how does that relate to what I do with the display layout? I'm able to have people come up close to it and they can look in a building and they can actually see detail in it. You can certainly do that with smaller scales, but it takes a lot more effort. It takes the effort because you have to have twice as much detail, twice as much space that you're trying to cover. And then you got to ask yourself the question, does somebody really see it? They may not actually see it. I have people that walk up to the layout of train shows, and I'll say, did you see what time it is in the country store there? They're like, what? And they look in and they go, oh, there's a clock on the wall. So the ability to have things like that people can actually, you may have to steer them to it, but the detail that you can have is what I like.
Yeah, the ability to have the clock on the wall readable is something that's neat. And, you're backing up for a second, talking about, us being our own worst critics, and we know the details are there, but the people that see our layouts, you're right, sometimes they have to be steered to it. When they see the whole thing, they realize, wow, this looks really realistic. But to get them to kind of focus in to the macro level and really start looking at, the clock has a time on it. There is an electrical meter on the side of the building. The building has gutters. There are 3 different colors of dirt within a certain patch of land.
Sure.
For visitors to the layout, they may not know exactly what you've done. All they know is that it looks right.
Well, the truth is, most people don't expect it, and that's not to say, Derek, that a lot of people don't go to that extra effort. But the truth is, most people don't expect it at a train show, especially on a traveling layout. I fought with what's the best way to keep this stuff on the layout while I'm traveling in a trailer. A lot of stuff falls off. If this was a layout built in a home, there'd be more detail on it because I'd never have to move it, never have to worry about it. So that's what I fought with is the clock going to fall off the wall? Is the detail items that I have in the store or in the post office, is it going to be there when I get to the train show? So far, I've been lucky and I haven't had a lot of damage. But people don't expect it, and that's what surprises them.
You bring up an interesting point talking about the traveling layout that you have, and one of my favorite things that I've learned from you, and I can't believe I didn't figure it out sooner, but when in your video about dirt, you talk about affixing things with Aquanet, and I went, holy cow, I wish I would have realized this years ago, because you showing people a couple of shots of Aquanet in a couple of different layers, helps hold just about anything in place, and especially ground cover and things like that. And I never thought about that before, but it works. Yeah, anything that's lightweight, like ground cover, ground foam, small leaves, twigs, and even dirt and dust, the Keep Hairspray is a really good method, because where else are you going to find a glue that is specifically made to hold on something that you can barely see, a grain of? Huh. And I guess my question to you is, where do you get your knowledge from? Because obviously, there's a lot of us in the community, and obviously, you're not figuring this all out on your own. Where are you going to learn from? I'm just curious. Well, the first key in my life, and I've probably had a lifelong attention deficit disorder where I have trouble paying attention to people, especially if they're not being entertaining. And I literally keep my eyes and ears open for, anything and everything, whether it's model railroaders or websites where there's guys building model planes and trains, and I have a lot of inspiration. I have, guys from the past, but nothing for a specific technique, so to speak. You pick up stuff here and there, you try it, it's the biggest thing I can say is think outside the box. There's not a product that's made for everything. And if you went to the store and you were looking, where's the ground foam holder honor? There's no such thing. There's not going to be some goofy, Road Runner, Acme ground foam holder, So you got to think outside the box. And the funny thing is you look at companies like Woodland Scenics and the companies that do this for mass market, and over the years, think about how many little products exist in the Woodland Scenics line alone that are designed to be mass market products to solve these problems that, we're solving with hairspray. They've just figured out a way to package it differently that's what that's for. So they've solved the problem by just packaging it in such a way that that's what it's supposed to do. Right. And I know a lot of people personally that when we're doing a project around the house or something like that, they go to the store and they're looking for the one widget that is made specifically to solve the problem that they're doing. Sometimes it's not. You have to look around the store. Go for a walk around the hardware store and look around. There's a lot of neat stuff there that you could use for a variety of different projects. Absolutely. Talking about learning scenery technique, through the years as you've learned more, tell me about a light bulb moment where you were just kind of struggling with a certain scenery technique and suddenly it just made sense. Tell me about that moment where you got it. I think it was weathering, whether it be locomotives or whether it be structures. It was weathering. The old traditional way of weathering is with the airbrush, and of course I have an airbrush and I've had one for a long time, but in the last 5 years, I don't think I've even taken it out of the box. And the reason is I've discovered chalks. And, Some guys call them pigments and they market them as pigments, but I found chalks, and it helped me because I was able to take off what I didn't like. Remember we talked about starting over? It's kind of hard to start over when you airbrush a locomotive or you airbrush a piece of plastic for a structure. You can't really just take that off. Right. So chalk, I guess, allows you some room to skate outside the line, so to speak? Yeah, it gives you the ability to kind of start over. If you apply it on and you don't like the results you have, you can wipe it back off. Okay. A question that comes to mind, and this is really definitely shows that we're an O-Gauge podcast. A lot of us are worried about, well, what happens when I go to sell this? Is chalk forgiving enough that theoretically something could be weathered and then completely taken back to original at some point? Well, no. Yes and no. And it's kind of like buying a new car. If you buy a new car and you go take it off-road and you're getting mud up underneath, and then you take it back to the dealership, that car is no longer new. You can wash it as good as you want, but it's still going to have something in it that, wasn't on the showroom floor. That's a good in that respect, too. No. If you're going to weather a model, it's no longer going to be new. So I suggest buying an older piece that you can dispose of and practice on that. That's what I do. There you go. And one of the other things I want to highlight, and like I said, Joey's YouTube channel is just out of this world. You have a great video on chalks. Getting chalks and weathering chalks doesn't necessarily have to be super expensive either. You give a couple of great suggestions of where you can get this stuff. And like I said, chalks don't necessarily break the bank, do they?
No, they're very inexpensive, and you can find the artist chalk everywhere. I get a lot of emails and correspondence, people trying to find these chalks, and the easiest place I can say to go is one of the craft stores, Michael's or AC Moore, one of those.
Okay. And then do the chalks come in powdered form? Do you have to ground your own? I mean, how does that work?
Well, these pastels come in the little sticks, the teacher size sticks.
Okay.
And there's not much to them, but really when it comes down to it, depending on what you're weathering, you're not using a lot of it anyway.
Okay. Just enough to smudge some dirt on and things like that, right?
Right, exactly.
Something else I kind of wanted to ask you about, and talking about weathering here specifically, for those of us who don't have that photographic memory and we kind of know what it looks like, does it make more sense for, let's say I want to weather a freight car, should I get on the internet and find a photo of the car that I want to weather or a similar type car and then look at that car in the real world to copy it? Well, I guess I've always struggled with, where does the weathering go? How does this make sense?
Yeah, of course, that's an easy method. Nowadays, we have the advantage of using the internet to quickly look up something, especially stuff like that, a freight car. I suggest go out to the railroad and find a car and look at the car and see how the weathering is on the car in real life, and start in small layers on your model. Take a picture of yourself is what I'm saying. Go out, take your cell phone camera or your inexpensive point-and-shoot camera. Take a picture of the freight car from different angles, and when you get back to your house, you can study it. And you don't just have one picture of a car at distance that somebody else took, but you took it, and you were out there, and you saw the patterns, the streaking rust, the dirt, the grime, that sort of thing.
You said a word there that kind of got my antenna up. You said the word patterns, and is weathering a freight car or a building or something like that, do things in the real world, and like I said, this is showing I am not a detail person. I will be the first one to admit that. But in real life, do things happen in patterns in terms of, do freight cars tend to weather in predictable ways, I guess is a good question.
Yeah, that is a good question, and the answer is sure, absolutely. If the way a freight car is made is definitely going to dictate where the weathering patterns are, where the rust is going to go, where the rivets and where the bolts and nuts and things are. It's all going to make a difference, and unless it's the same manufactured car, there's not a pattern that all cars have, but that particular car is going to have a wear pattern. And like I said, the easiest way to do is go out and look and see, why is there rust running down the side of that car just in that one spot? And if you take a picture and you study it and say, oh, okay, there's a set of bolts up top. There's a set of, rivets that are up there that are in this one spot on the roof that's where the rust is coming down from.
Got it.
It's really easy to figure out. It's not a scientific thing, but it's just kind of mimicking and looking at the way it happens in the real world, and then taking your, paintbrush and your chalk and just applying it.
That makes sense. And like I said, for a guy like me that is not a highly detail-oriented guy, having it explained to somebody, or having it explained to me by somebody who is able to look at the level of detail and go, okay, this is why this is happening. That makes it easier for me to understand. And I'm hoping that we have listeners today that struggle with the same thing that I do. We're not super detail-oriented, but when you hear somebody like Joey that can focus in on those details, that suddenly it's like, oh, okay, there is, a reason why that car looks like that. And just, it's a learned technique, learning to focus in on things like that and understand why, a car is doing what it's doing in its weathering patterns.
Yeah, and it's not just cars, it's landscape and it's buildings and things like that, where, think about erosion, where there's a hill and there's dirt coming off the hill running down into where the tracks are, and even the tracks themselves. If you go out to any right-of-way, you'll see how there's patterns of grease and there's patterns of dirt and all kinds of stuff. You can see where the soil is eroded, and there's, brown areas around the ballast, and it's interesting to go out and look at. If you just take the time, that's all it takes, a little bit of time, go out and see how it is in the real world.
Something that I saw, and like I said, this is the third time I brought it up during this interview, but you guys need to go watch Joey's YouTube videos. So I was prepping for this interview the other night and watching, and we're talking about chalks here, and talking about weathering track. And one of the things that I found really interesting about the track weathering video with chalks is
on the side of the rails right before you finish this thing, you put this super bright red color on the side of the rails. And I'm like, there's no way this is going to end up looking right. And then suddenly, you put one final coat of black dusting on it, and all of a sudden everything just darkens down. And suddenly it's like, oh my gosh, that really is right. I guess I was just really surprised that you could go from one step of going, there's no way this is going to look right, to taking that next step and going, wow, maybe that is the right way to do it.
Yeah, everything is dulled down in the real world, and weathering and Mother Nature takes care of that for us. But if you go out to the railroad tracks in the late afternoon and you watch how the sun shines and illuminates the rail, sometimes, depending on where you're at, you'll see it almost really does look like an orange color, and depending on what light is shining on it. So if you think about how that is a specific moment that you don't normally see all day long, the rail really is a bright color. But once you take the light away from it directly, it's dulled down. And that's the simulation that I'm trying to do with that, is give it what it's supposed to have if you had no weathering on it at all, and then hit it with the dust, and then it comes back to what it's supposed to look like.
That brings up an interesting point when it comes to lighting the layout. Do you find that it's easier to make the scenery fit the light in terms of, is it easier for you to weather with a certain light in mind, or do you try, especially on a permanent layout setup, do you try and configure the lights to fit the scenery? Does that make sense, what I'm asking?
Yeah, it makes sense. And if it was permanent layout I was working on, it would be the lighting that would be my first consideration, that everybody that comes in and sees the layout, and myself, this is the normal conditions that the layout's going to be in. And lighting considerations should be, taken at that time, in the beginning. Now, if it's a portable layout, you don't know where you're going to be. You don't know where the most people are going to see it. And if you photograph it, as I have done with the spruce layout, I take it outside. So really, that's not a consideration. I don't build the layout around the lighting because I know it's going to be in a bunch of different places.
Okay. For layouts that are going to be in permanent situations, and I know everybody's got an opinion on it, when it comes to lighting, what do you prefer in terms of permanent room lighting that's going to have a layout?
If you look at the engineering that goes behind lighting, there's different color temperatures that lights have. And the warmer you can get your lights, it's going to have a more natural look to it, a more natural daylight or mid-morning look. If you take an average fluorescent light, it's going to have a blue color. But now they make them where you can actually choose the different color temperatures for your light. So the higher the number, the brighter or the warmer it's going to be. So if you have to use fluorescent lighting, which I don't use, I like incandescent lighting. It's a warmer tone.
Okay. For those of us that aren't, deep into this, my assumption is the warmer the light is, the closer it gets to natural daylight. Is that correct?
That's correct. If you go in a warehouse that has fluorescent lighting, if you look up, you notice it'll have a cooler, I don't know if most people could see it, but a blue cast to it. It's called a color cast in your light balance. The brighter you can get, the warmer you can get, it's going to produce a more natural look, in photographs especially.
Talking about lighting for a second, something that I'm excited to see how it plays into model railroading as the years go by here going into the future. With these LED bulbs coming into the market that really can reproduce and are getting better every year at reproducing, virtually any color on the spectrum. I'm excited to see when guys start to introduce those kind of bulbs into a layout, and suddenly you can, get on your iPhone and talk to these smart bulbs that you can suddenly change the color on your layout to, dusk or to early morning. And I think that's going to open up a completely new world of possibilities in how we see our layouts.
Oh, absolutely. I agree. Anytime you can have a new product that gives you the ability to make changes after the fact, I'm all for it. Yeah,
that's going to be fun to see. Something that we started talking about at the beginning, and I want to come back and address it specifically, is budget scenery supplies. And we talked a little bit about cardboard. We've talked about hairspray. What are some of your other favorite budget scenery supplies that you use on a frequent basis that you can find running around the house?
Without a doubt, furnace filters. And
really?
Unless you have baseboard heat, you don't have furnace filters. Furnace filters I've used for years on almost every layout I've had in every scale, and you're able to do something with them, whether it's bushes, vines, branches for trees, things like that. That's my number one go-to. You know.
Wow. You know, I've never heard that before, and maybe I just haven't read enough, but you're the first person who's ever suggested that. And I tell you what, if somebody takes something away from this podcast, I think that's it. I had never even thought about that before. Wow.
Yeah. I don't know where I got that technique from. I probably saw it or read it in a magazine somewhere. I can't say specifically I got it from one person, but I don't think I'm smart enough to have invented it myself. But I definitely use them for almost everything. In some of the videos we have on the channel, you'll see me using the furnace filter. You see the different ways you can use them. And some of the ways I haven't shown yet are creekside roots. You know how the roots hang off the bank and things? I'd like to do a video about that sometime.
Man, a lot. You know, and like I said, those are the things that, you know, here in O-Gauge and in toy train world, we don't often think about things like that. But when you think about it in the context that you're saying it, you know, tear this furnace filter apart and suddenly you have creek roots. You know, I guess, you know, my brain just doesn't work that way, and it's phenomenal that yours does. You know, and that's the great thing about having a lot of people in this hobby. We all have different gifts and talents, and the fact that you, Joey, can share something with me that, you know, is going to make my layout better, and I know there are folks that have shared stuff with you that make your layout better. That's one of the beautiful things about model railroading is it's one giant community.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. It's definitely, in my case, I'm definitely an artist type. I'm not a scientist or mechanical engineer by any means. But it's sometimes it's a blessing and a curse, because sometimes I end up thinking too deeply into this stuff and forget a job I'm supposed to be doing in my real daytime work, and I'm here thinking about a new way to make ground cover or make trees or water or what have you.
It's, you know, and that's a beautiful thing, though, about model railroading is it's something to pour creative energy into, especially if you're an artist type or, you know, for me, it's a mechanical type. You know, it's something to pour and funnel that creative energy into. And that's the cool thing about building a layout is whether you're an artist, whether you're mechanical, you know, just about most skill sets, you can find a way to work into a model train layout. And that, I think, is what makes this hobby so incredible is no matter what you're good at, more than likely, there's a way you can funnel that energy into your layout.
Yeah, model railroading is definitely not a one-facet hobby like stamp collecting or coin collecting or what have you. It definitely has all of the elements that people use in everyday life, from construction to artistic type things.
I'm going to ask you a tough question, but I like questions like this because they force people to think outside of the box. Imagine for a moment you had to build a layout and you could only include one key scenery element. What would you use and why?
Steep terrain.
Okay.
Steep terrain
Why?
Because most layouts you see, especially modular layouts, people, I think when they build them and they consider having to transport them, that they have to be flat, you know, the tabletop style. And if you look at a lot of the videos on YouTube, you'll see a lot of train shows with flat tabletop style layouts where people stick the trees on it when they get there. I have to have that steep terrain because it gives it a sense of place, at least for what I model. Now, if you're modeling a desert, you know, maybe it's a different story. But in Appalachia, there's mountains, there's hills, there's valleys, there's streams, and it has to include that scenery element for me.
Got it. And yeah, I think that's interesting that you're right, you know, because on a modular layout, you know, the modular layouts I've seen, you know, you're looking at the module and the module itself looks great, but then as your eyes follow to the back of the module, it just drops off the edge and it's like, oh, look, there's that big center open space that all the guys are hanging out in. And
Absolutely.
What you're saying with steep terrain, it gives your eyes something to go up.
Exactly. And in a lot of cases, you can disguise that with a good backdrop, but most of these train shows, I see the guys aren't using, you know, the backdrop. And that's one of the reasons I designed my backdrops to give an additional sense of life beyond the layout, was because most people don't think of that. They really don't. It's not me. It's probably not, it has nothing to do with their skill level. It's just they get swayed into thinking that there's only one way to do it. But there's so many other ways you can simulate your layout being where it's supposed to be instead of just being on a tabletop.
One of my favorite videos that you have, and I thought this was really fun, is you open a video with a chassis system caboose in the middle of a really bright, sunny day in what looks like the beginning of spring, and suddenly you pop off the back of the diorama, you're in jacket, hat, gloves, and there's probably a couple of feet of snow on the ground. And that just proves this idea that, backdrops can really make a huge difference in terms of taking you to a place that you may not necessarily have thought about. And it takes you away from the brick basement walls and things like that.
Oh, absolutely. I take that diorama with me to all the train shows I go to. And on my tablet, when guys come around, I start showing them the video there, actually I show them usually a photograph. And they're, where's that? Is that a layout? And I said, no, it's right there on the table. And they're like, wow, it's that diorama? Yeah, it's only 8 inches wide. There's so much you can do in such a small space. And, I'm going to be the first to say you have no excuse. You can model almost anywhere you want. You don't need the space. You can do it.
Absolutely. Something that brings to my mind is for us O-Gauge guys that just have these massive layouts. You talk about what you can accomplish in an 8-inch space, and you really can accomplish some phenomenal things in an 8-inch space. But for those of us that have these larger layouts, what would you recommend tackling first in terms of scenery to start getting things to look right? Because I think a lot of us just wanted to start looking right before we start detailing and super detailing, these 1 or 2 foot sections at a time. Where's the best place to start on a big layout?
Well, if I had a layout in my house and it was my super dream O-scale layout, I would probably, after getting the track laid, I would start with that scenery, the landforms. I would start with the landforms and decide what I'm going to do with this. Of course, this is after you decide what you're doing with the backdrop, if you're using a backdrop or if you're not. But if you are, the earlier you do the backdrop, the easier it is. Retrofitting is very hard, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. I have some stories about that, but we'll save those for another podcast. But yes, listen to Joey. He's telling you the truth.
Yeah, retrofitting a backdrop into a layout that has scenery on it is it's difficult. I've done it. I've helped people do it. And believe me, you might as well look at it as an excuse to start your layout over, because that's what you're going to end up doing if you wait too long. You can do it, and depending on how much scenery you have, you can do it. But if you have a lot of scenery, if a lot of terrain, a lot of trees up against where the backdrop should be, it's a lot easier to do it, with that forethought.
Yep. Like I said, the man speaks the truth. Listen to him. He knows what he is talking about. If you're going to do a backdrop, do it at the beginning. And you know what? And spend some money on your backdrop, because the backdrops do a great job of hiding a lot of ugly rooms, and it really adds an element to the layout that you're not going to get from super detailing a building, or, if you spend all this time super detailing stuff, but it's against a white brick basement wall, it's still not going to look right. So yeah, for those of you who are at the early stages of your layout, especially if you want to do really detailed scenery, consider a backdrop, and consider a photorealistic backdrop, because it makes a lot of sense, and it's going to make things look a lot better when you get to that point where you're done or getting done with the layout, and you're looking at that wall going, man, I'm glad I did that, as opposed to left it blank.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of guys out there that have no intention to have a super detailed layout other than a grass mat and a Lionel set or MTH trains running around, the smoke coming out. And that's great. I love that stuff too. But if I can stick a realistic looking backdrop behind it, and people come in, and it actually puts your layout in a place, it gives it the place where it's supposed to be, life beyond the layout.
Right. And, in talking about this, just in the context of O-Gauge trains, I think there's a place for realistic backdrops even with toy trains, because, the whole point behind toy trains, and really, Lionel has been promoting this in the hobby for decades now, is that it's your imagination. And for years in the 30s, 40s, and 50s and 60s, it was use your imagination to imagine the scene. And, nowadays, yeah, you can still do that, and that's still wonderful, but you can still put your trains into these toy trains into realistic scenery, and it makes it that much easier for visitors to your layout to draw those connections between the places that you've already gone with your imagination.
Oh, absolutely. Depending on your skill set with your modeling, it definitely can't hurt to give the layout some kind of scenery beyond what you're doing. Give it that place. Give it the place that you envision it to be.
Right. We're going to start. I've got a couple more questions for you before we wrap this thing up. Like I said, we talked about your YouTube channel extensively. If people haven't gotten the point yet, you need to look at Joey's YouTube videos. Spend some time on his YouTube channel. You will be very happy that you did, especially if you're looking to up your game in the scenery department. You've got nearly 30 videos on there right now. If you were going to pick a couple of key videos that people should check out first, what do you want them to watch?
Well, that's a wide open question, because in all of the videos we try to add a sense of interestingness to it, if you know what I mean. A lot of the videos out there, how do you say it without sounding rude, they are just somebody doing something, and they don't have the element of a person actually talking to you. Just like a teacher in a classroom. If I'm in a classroom, I want the teacher to be standing and talking to me and not just showing us a PowerPoint and saying, here, this is how you do it. But I would say really any of the videos, because you can get inspiration from the how-to videos by the actual content itself showing you how to do something, or even the railfan videos, which may inspire you to see some scenery or equipment that you want to model.
Yep. And the great thing about these videos, you're going to have fun watching them. That's one of the things that drew me to these videos, is not only the level of scenery work, because there's a lot of great modelers out there on YouTube, but it's the content is very dry sometimes. And with you, there's almost always a backstory kind of going on in your videos. You like to have fun when you make those videos. And for a guy like me, that makes them that much more interesting to watch, is watching you have fun and explain the technique and inject your sense of humor into these videos has made it that much easier to watch and learn from the videos.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to be honest and say I'm on YouTube every day, whether it's wiring up my job trailer, trying to figure out the wiring. I'll go on and try to find out some wiring. And sure, in cases like that, I just want to see how the guy wired the trailer or something. But something like model railroading, where there's more to it that you're trying to do, I think it helps to have that sense of humor and other interesting, information in it.
Yeah, for sure. So what is the URL for the YouTube channel? What's the name on the YouTube channel? I want to make sure I've got it right. It is Trackside Scenery, correct?
Correct. It's youtube.com/Trackside Scenery.
Perfect. And for those of you listening, please do go check it out. Obviously, Trackside Scenery is more than a YouTube channel. It's your company. Tell me about some of the products that you guys offer that fit in well for us O-Gauge guys.
Well, especially the backdrops, as we've talked about before. And I'll be honest and say that I was really surprised when I started offering these commercially, the number of O-Gauge guys that were getting backdrops. When you hear a lot of the people talking about the smaller scales, and you and I both know from the whole trade of model railroading that HO scale probably dominates it, but I probably have an even mix of O-Gauge and HO gauge modelers that buy from me. But backdrops especially, we offer building flats, hybrid flats that use a combination of the photographic backdrop with wood products. We offer structure kits, detail parts, and things like that. Always something new coming out.
Yeah, and one thing, I want to take a second and spend just a second on flats too. Flats are something that are new to me this year, and I had the challenge of a backdrop and tracks right against the basement wall and no space to fit in buildings, and I just started using flats this year. And flats are a really cheap and easy way to fill in space, especially tight spaces on a layout, and they make a huge difference. So if you're looking for a way to fill in some space along a wall or a tight area, seriously consider adding building flats, because it makes a big difference for not a lot of money.
Absolutely. And in some cases, I have people ask me when they come to a show, do you have that building? Is that building a flat? And it's actually in the backdrop. And I said, no, but the one next to it is. So it is really hard to tell. If you do it right and you disguise it well enough, you can't tell if it's actually part of the backdrop or actually sitting in front of it.
We'll wrap up on this question. If you could offer one piece of advice to somebody who's struggling to bring their scenery up to the next level, what would it be?
Have no fear. That's what I'd say. Have no fear. Think outside the box, and always remember that you can remove what you did. In most cases, you can remove what you did. You can take it off. You built the layout. You built the diorama. You put the scenery on there, and you can take it off. If you can, refinish your own floors or painted a wall at any time in your life, you know that you can repaint it. You can paint over. You can sand it down. You can always start over.
You've been listening to Joey Ricard. The website is TracksideScenery.com. The YouTube channel is youtube.com/Trackside Scenery. Joey, thanks so much for your time. We will talk to you again soon. Thanks again.
My pleasure. Thank you.
My thanks to Joey Ricard for his great interview. Please do visit his website, TracksideScenery.com. And that's going to wrap it up for this episode of Notch 6. A couple of notes before we go. Number one, welcome to our new producer, Dennis Hall. Dennis, welcome aboard to the Notch 6 crew. Dennis is going to be the guy responsible for making me sound awesome here over the next few months. Just happy to have you here, Dennis. So welcome aboard to Dennis Hall as the new editor, producer for Notch 6. Please keep an eye on Notch6.com in the month of July as we will post announcements there about convention coverage and how we'll be handling that. Again, we may have a couple of special surprises regarding the convention. As always, you'll hear from all your favorites from YNL. Al Colas will be back as the co-host. We'll have Mike Reagan, Howard Hitchcock, the entire Lionel team will be around for this show or this series of shows. So we look forward to bringing that to you from Boston at the end of July. Again, watch Notch6.com for that information. That'll do it for this time, folks. Until next time, please keep it in Notch 6.
Thanks for listening to Notch 6, the only podcast dedicated to O-gauge trains. You can find every episode on our website, Notch6.com, or on iTunes and Stitcher. We'll see you again soon. Until then, be sure to keep it in Notch 6. The following has been a production of Notch 6 Media and is intended for private use only. This show may not be copied or redistributed without express written consent. This show copyright 2015, all rights reserved.